Hello, my name's Dr. Edd Pitt. I'm a reader in higher education in the Centre for Study of Higher Education at the University of Kent. I'd like to begin this keynote by defining what we mean by assessment. Some definitions of assessment focus more on summative assessment, that is, seeing it as a process by which academics assure academic standards. But assessment for learning, rather than assessment of learning, offers more evidence of effectiveness within the literature. So assessment is when students do something that they and others can then observe and draw some conclusions about. Thus, assessment, defined broadly in this way, can occur anywhere in the instructional cycle. It can be written, verbal, individual, or group-based. It can be as small as answering a question in a seminar, or as big as a year-long research project. It can count towards a student's mark, or it might not. So when we think of student activity, it's about designing for students to do something and have opportunities to have feedback on that activity, whether from a computer, from peers, from a client, from themselves, or possibly from you, represents this definition in practice. One way to think of assessment is in terms of its authenticity. Authentic assessment should be challenging, offer real-world application, and develop evaluative judgment. Authenticity has been identified as a key characteristic of assessment design, which promotes learning. Authentic assessment aims to replicate the task and performance standards typically found in the world of work, and has been found to have a positive impact on student learning, helps them solve problem skills, promotes autonomy, enhances motivation, provides opportunities for students to self-regulate, and develop metacognition. These sort of areas are also highly related with employability. Now, when it comes to challenging, cognitive challenge has been emphasised, but we can also consider situations that involve emotional or ethical challenges, as well as cognitive challenge to be authentic. Authentic assessment has been defined in various ways, and it involves realism or real-world application, which emphasises the relevance of assessment activities, topics or processes to the real world. Now, normally what tends to happen is that we emphasise employment contexts within our programs, but it can refer to any real-world activity, which also opens up the possibility of connecting to larger issues like sustainability or social justice that may not be foregrounded in a particular career, but which require the application of higher education knowledge and skills, and which students are often very concerned about. Thirdly, authentic assessment helps students to develop an understanding of what constitutes quality, and more about that later, in a field, and grows their ability to make that judgment about their own and others' work. Now, one way that we would suggest that we could operationalise some of these elements of authentic assessment is through the Learning Principles Checklist. And this provides a useful way for us to question the extent to which any given assessment or feedback practice promotes learning. It's helpful to think in terms of underlying learning principles because it helps us to categorise different practices, critique the practices, and the research based on them. And it also helps us to explain the effects of various particular assessment practices. These principles on the screen here define what George Koo and his colleagues in the US call high-impact practices. One can engage in authentic assessment, though without incorporating all 8 of these principles. Thus, it is easier to implement in many different modules across a programme of study. So when assessing any given assessment activity, I would encourage you to ask yourself the questions that are on the screen right now. Now, I wanted to give you some examples of some authentic assessment that are directly applied to the delegates that are within this conference. So we've got here an authentic assessment task for forensic analytical chemistry. Now, within this experience that the students will go through, this group project, we're looking at crime scene investigation of a simulated crime scene. All students are expected to assume the role of Sherlock Holmes, in which they are required to solve a range of real-world problems in forensic analysis under a simulated crime scene setting. A simulated crime scene case, creating this real-world relevance, is set up in a classroom to induce a sense of suspense and intrigue, while at the same time helping students hone their skills in identifying chemicals, powder, pills, hair and fur, and fluids left behind in the crime scene. Quite often this is an ill-defined problem that is open to multiple interpretations. Students are required to follow structured investigation steps that were previously discussed in class. The crime scene reconstruction means that students create a presentation that includes, but are not limited to, the physical evidence found, the respective analysis for identification and comparison, and the conclusion of the criminal case. The takeaway, therefore, is that the simulation mimics complex real-life situations that engage students in practical tasks and motivates them to try different alternatives to solve problems. So it's this synergy between the content and the theory that happens in class and the application that is very much channeling towards the real-world setting that students may experience if they, for example, go off to become a crime scene investigator. The second example I want to share with you is a switch to authentic assessment in biochemistry. So traditional exam questions, as you can see on the screen, you're probably familiar with this tone, is something that we've all experienced, but these lecturers wanted to try and change this into something slightly different called a CAP study. So each lecturer provided a problem-based learning clue for analysis, which might turn out to be useful or may be a red herring. Examples included Ashley's blood glucose reading, genetic sequencing to look for mutations that might cause sudden cardiac death syndrome, and histopathology and immunofluorescent microscopy images of Ashley's liver cells. These relate to the learning outcomes of the module. So again, in this example, we have the synergy between the content and now an applied example, so a scenario if you like. And the students were trained during the lab practicals to carry out these analytical techniques, to analyse data, perform calculations and write a lab report. And what this scenario did was to piece together and get them to critically analyse all of the clues that they'd seen within the scenario and submit an initial hypothesis and request for clinical data at the lab door. In the second part of the assessment, they were using this clinical data to complete a written report which could contain data analysis, conclusion and diagnosis. So the students were going to work through this imaginary scenario about what happened to Ashley Taylor and directly apply, and the audience that they were writing the report for had synergy with the real world setting that students would potentially go on to do in future careers. And both of these examples give students an opportunity for authentic assessment, but also when it comes to applying for potential roles outside of university when they graduate, they have direct experience and things that they can draw on when it comes to interview, which will hopefully show them in a better light than other people that maybe haven't had those experiences. So I wanted to flag up the National Student Survey, and the conference organisers have said to me that this is something that is really important for us to consider as academics, and I agree. And we've got two sections of the NSS. And we know that we have two questions that relate to assessment, really, around the criteria and the marking of assessment. And I wanted to sort of flesh out around how these metrics can be woven into the teaching experience to help us to address some of those challenges. So when it comes to working with criteria, quite often the practice is that we put the criteria onto the VLE, and the question is, will our students engage with this? Now technically we've put them on the VLE and they're available in advance, but I want us to focus in on that word clear and how students might understand clear. Now what are the ways that we could suggest that we work with this is that we get students to actually actively work with criteria, and we can do that in a number of ways. We could get them to understand the criteria by working through rubrics so that we could explain marking rubrics to them. We could do videos or screencast opportunities to get the students to understand how criteria operates within, for example, a piece of work. As we mark the work, we can explain how criteria map onto a particular element within that work. Or we could get them to work through exemplars in class where they are actually asked to apply the criteria to pieces of work that they and their previous students had completed. So these could be previous work or examples from previous years, and the key with this is not only students understanding the criteria, but they're also understanding the marking process so that they can start to realise that how we mark and how fairness and rigour are completely woven into the fabric of the way that we operate. So we're in a sense trying to demystify the process about what happens to student work when it gets submitted. We're also giving them pre-submission understanding of how to work with criteria and understand different levels of quality within that criteria. And I think what we also need to think about is when we're thinking around assessment is these guiding questions. Now clearly we want things to be valid in terms of accurately assessing the learning objectives, and we will have all the assessment that are tied closely to learning objectives. So just checking our assessment and making sure that we articulate that to our students about how elements within that piece of work that they submit and how that aligns to learning outcomes can be a good way to ensure that students understand this validity. In terms of fairness, I mentioned before about knowing the criteria and understanding a marking process, but also explaining to them about the rigour about how we mark, but also the processes that exist outside of the first marker in terms of second marking and external examiner involvement. And that also understanding for students might help them to realise that assessment is reliable. We calibrate and we have second marking processes that enable us to make sure that all markers that are involved in marking within modules or programme teams are readily understanding criteria and mapping this onto, in a reliable and rigorous manner, all pieces of work that students submit. And finally, we want to consider, as I mentioned earlier, the authenticity. And is there an opportunity within your existing frameworks to make your assessments more authentic, that are aligned to clear disciplinary norms or work that might go on within students' lives when they leave university that reflect the real world? Now, I wanted to also draw your attention towards feedback. And something I've been talking about over the last few years is the way that we control the narrative around what feedback is in higher education. And this is very much within our gift. When we get our students in their first year, we can set the tone and we can set the expectations for what feedback is and the culture around feedback. And one of the enduring cultures that we have is around timeliness of feedback. And timeliness generally operates in higher education around the notion that we get the feedback back to students within a notional 3 to 4 week turnaround when it's tied to summative work. The problem with this is that it foregrounds assessment and feedback being very much related to summative. And what we know from lots of research, and I've highlighted one here from Norway, is that students want specific, understandable and actionable feedback. The problem is, when this is received at the end of an assessment period, there's very little that they can do with that feedback for that piece of assessment. So students are telling us that they want it prior to submission. And also students are saying to us, well, all of these tasks that you design and all of these activities, what is in it for us? We ask them to engage, but they quite readily ask the question, what is it in for us? So I would always advocate explaining to students why we're doing these things and the holistic picture of a programme. So the final point on this is that feedback always needs somewhere to land. So how does your feedback mechanisms within your framework, within your programme, within your module, afford students opportunities to enact feedback? Are there landing sites where they can see clear opportunities to enact feedback? And one of the ways that I've suggested in the past around this is weaving this into the curriculum, thinking about where feedback is within your curriculum, and more about that later. I've also carried out a systematic literature review in the last few months for Advanced HE, which was a very vast study around the last 6 years of assessment and feedback research. Over 3,000 articles featured, and the overriding summary and implications for practitioners focused on these three things: around shifting the culture so that students are using feedback, treating feedback as an ongoing positive relationship and not a one-off event, and increasing opportunities for peer assessment and peer feedback. And if any of you want to contact me to get this review, I'm more than happy to share or come and speak to you individually about this. So please contact me after the keynote. So you'll know that the NSS has assessment and feedback questions, as I mentioned earlier, and I wanted to focus now onto the feedback questions. So the feedback on my work has been timely, and I mentioned about the 3-week turnarounds, can sometimes make students think that feedback is only available to them at the end of this turnaround period. But I would argue that this is in fact not the right thing to be thinking about, and that there are opportunities for us to leverage some of the things that we already do within our curricula so that students realise that this is actually feedback. So when it comes to the question, I've received helpful comments on my work, there are some ways that we're able to help students to give more positive responses to this in terms of the notion of feedback opportunities existing within the teaching time is something that has started to emerge within the literature. And the question I have is that how much time do we give to informal verbal feedback in our teaching? Many of us probably spend large portions of time talking to students in sessions, questioning them, probing them, getting them to elaborate on their understanding, and having this dialogue between us around their knowledge and understanding of particular concepts in the relevant fields, I would argue is feedback. Now, lots of these interactions are affirming their responses to us, and we're helping them to understand where their current knowledge and understanding sits. Now, surely the act of doing that is giving them feedback. We also might give them feedback on particular things that they present to us, perhaps work in progress or following seminar group work they have engaged in with peers. And when they feedback to class through their verbal feedback opportunities existing in the curriculum. But do our students understand and appreciate this? Is their level of feedback literacy to a point where they understand that feedback isn't just written comments at the end of a piece of work? So I want us to think about where are the opportunities for informal feedback within our curricula, and would you be able to get credit for that so that students can identify that as you've designed that in? So we could, for example, do some of these things on here, and I wanted to highlight a couple of these. We could create opportunities for more interaction within peers in the class time. We could use the VLE to have feedback opportunities and dialogue. And we could also encourage our students to engage in more internal feedback, that is generating feedback for themselves. Students are generating this through the key internal mechanisms for them to be able to reference all of those things that they've seen and experienced in their course, the materials, the objects, and the quality of the feedback that they've had from their academics. And they synthesize that and generate feedback for themselves about where they currently are in their knowledge and understanding and how they may be able to improve. This then enables them to have a powerful effect upon future learning behaviour, as they're able to make logical and well-informed internal feedback assumptions about their own work, and they're less reliant on feedback coming from a source such as an academic. This is going to mirror some of the things that they will need when they leave us and go into employability. They won't always be able to go and ask someone for help all of the time in the real world setting. As I draw the conclusion to this talk, I wanted to put these three things on the screen. And these are ideas about how feedback can be woven into the process. And if we think about the first one on the left here, I mentioned about pre-task guidance. This can have a really profound effect on students so that students are really prepared for the task. So using exemplars and criteria is something that's really powerful for students to feel prepared. The second one is around similar tasks that build and have integrated opportunities for peers to mark and comment on each other's formative work. And each cycle of feedback enables them to apply comments to the next iteration before the final summative submission. So in this case, feedback is designed in. And the final one on the right there is where students undertake a first task, say a lab report, and then they're followed by feedback that they use that specific feedback to inform a second related task. So it could be, for example, a simulation task that I mentioned earlier. So we're moving away here from students not having landing sites so that they can specifically see where feedback is integrated. And one of the ways that we can do this is by thinking about this design process at the beginning of our modules. How do we design feedback in rather than it being a bolt-on at the end of a piece of work? And I wanted to give you some examples about how we can use technology to get our students to engage with feedback during the process. So we could use, for example, online quizzes. And one of the ways that this is beneficial is that we create banks of questions which students complete, and the associated feedback can unearth gaps in knowledge and direct future learning. And really this is getting students to understand that this is a key feedback opportunity, and it moves away from them thinking that feedback only happens at the end of a summative piece of work. And more importantly for us as academics, it's a lower marking workload because the automation exists within the software. As you'll see on the screen there, I've mentioned screen capture software. We can, as I mentioned earlier, we can work through marking. We can record that live so students can understand different levels of quality. These could be exemplars, and it might reduce the time burden of explaining and giving students specific examples time and time again in an individual sense. Similarly, we might be able to use wearable technology to record lab practicals. So we could wear the technology as we explain the labs to students. We could work through those and we could create a bank of lab practicals that students could access. We could also use decision trees where we can send students on a journey about decisions around what might happen in a lab, what to do next, the right, the wrong way, and the sort of actions that might happen in that sense. And this could be a lower risk. And what this also does is it tends to the audio sense of relational dynamics that have been proven within audio feedback. And that leads me on to the final one about audio or video feedback, to create group level feedback. Again, some ways of accessing large groups with feedback is to do group level feedback. A quick recording or an example from marking something can give students an access into what's going on with that group, and again, this could also be used as a way of preparing students for a subsequent assessment. And finally, to summarise, the points on the screen here are to emphasise the points that I've been making today, in that feedback at the end of an assessment has limited value. It's great for us to really start thinking about feedback and assessment at the start of the year and explaining to students about how it exists, how to use it, and keep repeating this time after time so students understand the culture of feedback within your curriculum. Using exemplars and marking exercises really helps students understand what constitutes quality. Ensuring feedback has a place to land so that we signpost opportunities for subsequent use of feedback. It's woven into formative and summative tasks. And we think about the specific nature of our actionable comments and avoid sort of general comments. So we want comments that have a directive function. And finally, provide linked assessment for feedback to be enacted across a programme of study so that we avoid this silo effect, and so that we actually get students to engage in assessment and feedback across a programme of study that we have all planned together and thought about together, so it is a joined up offer. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions after you've listened to this keynote.